Hi, we're back and we're ready to discuss the second commandment of grace. As I said in the introduction, one doesn't learn these commandments of grace intellectually or even from a Bible passage. One learns this from experience, and the second commandment was probably one of the toughest ones for me to learn. I learned it on day 3 going into day 4. It was a nighttime nightmare experience. Because on day 3, where we had our little interview that delayed my team, was a lovely, lovely fountain of the last fresh running water for this 5-day trip. So we all filled up our water bottles very excitedly, and I forgot to put in my water purification tablets. And this is where I think things went wrong. It could also have been that morning's water that wasn't boiled to death. Because when you go to a higher altitude, of course, water doesn't boil at 100 degrees. It boils at a much lower temperature, meaning that you don't get all the bacteria to die in time. So this was, whatever the reason was for the contaminated water, I had 5 liters of it. Because what a law-abiding, law-loving person does is when the sign at the foot of Kilimanjaro says drink between 3 and 5 liters of water, you drink 5. Because you're forever overachieving on the rules. So that's what I did. I had 5 liters of contaminated water, and that night, the night of day 3, I just couldn't get warm in my bed, and then I was burning up, but I was shaking, and it took me a few hours to figure out that I was really sick. And then my stomach started acting up, and I had to fly over my tent mate, zip open that tent flap, and speed off to the long drop. And when I got to this long drop toilet, I was so upset that I forgot that I was sick, because it was just an absolute mess. I started scooting stuff into the little hole in the ground, because that's what I do. When there's evidence of something that's not okay, I fix it. And then I think, how can people be like this? How can people make such a mess? How can people not understand how disrespectful this is? So I had on my Crocs. Just to clarify how I did this little exercise, I had on my Crocs and I had wet wipes, which is requirement number 1 when you go on a mountain climb. And I had the wet wipes over the tips of my shoes, and I was literally kicking and scooting and scraping everything into the slit. Instead of worrying about the germs that were accumulating in my own body and the danger of breathing in even more on top of that, what I already had, I was cleaning up other people's mess. And afterwards, I made sure that everything was as sanitary as possible, using almost my entire pack of wet wipes, which would prove to be a big mistake. And then I left. And as I was, making my way through the dark back to my tent, God just put his finger on my heart and he said, Hetty, you know why you're cleaning up the toilets behind everybody else? It's not because you're a servant. It's not because you're humble enough. It's not because you care about the state in which the next person is going to find the toilet. It's all for yourself. Because the real reason you're doing this is you're afraid that when you step out of the long drop and somebody may be waiting outside, they will think it's your mess. You just want to appear clean and innocent. You're window dressing, you're cleaning the outside like the Pharisees did, forgetting that what's on the inside is more important. You should have worried about being sick, and you should have gotten yourself away from the germs as fast as you could. But no, your pride does this. And then I remembered so many instances of doing exactly this. In our younger years, we toured a lot with my husband's band, and we toured with these young musicians who are dreamers, the creative type. So whenever the guys stayed in people's homes, when we did the round to pick up all the band members, I would find an excuse to go into the home where they stayed, to go and see if they had made their beds, if they had washed their stubble out of the basins and stuff, and I would go and clean up behind everybody else. And God was reminding me of all these things that I always did, and a new perspective dawned on me, and I realized I'm doing this to look good. Because the law loves only the ones who've got their act together, the ones who leave a clean toilet, not the ones who leave a mess, not the ones who don't have it all together. Now, at this point, the lesson was starting to sink in. I was going to have it massaged in the next day, because I didn't really sleep that night. So the next morning, I was the way you are when you had diarrhea all night long. and where you sometimes made it to the long drop on time and sometimes not. So I was out of clean clothes, out of wet wipes, and just spent. And the altitude was pretty severe. This trek is what I call the saddle trek, and it is from Lake Mawenzi, which is next to the Kilimanjaro that we all know, but that is where you climb up to acclimatize, and then you climb over the saddle all the way to the actual mountain that you're going to summit on that night. So we're trekking across the saddle, and I am way in the back, not because I'm obedient to leading from behind, but because I'm falling behind and I am hopelessly terrible. And every time somebody takes a break to eat, I excuse myself and I stand to the side because I smell bad. Because out of respect for the people who are eating, I'm trying not to stink in their nostrils. That's just how bad it was. And this diarrhea wasn't giving up at all. It was just going on. It was relentless. Even though I wasn't eating, I couldn't eat. I was still drinking, trying not to dehydrate. And I was just behind a rock every, 20 minutes maybe. And on the saddle, unfortunately, the terrain changes to something that looks like desert. So you have little rocks every here and there. And at some point, my options were which team sees me from behind and which team sees me from the front, as I try and hide as much of myself behind a little rock as I possibly can to hold on to the last bit of dignity. And then to also keep in mind, am I upwind or downwind? Just no dignity left. It was the dirty toilet I couldn't clean up. It was the absolute mess I had no control over. And as I was behind one of these rocks, I was reminded of the words by Philip Yancey where he said, "Grace, like water, always runs to the lowest point." And I can truly say that there at my lowest point, I experienced grace and understood that there is absolutely no way to ever understand, receive, or experience grace unless you go to the lowest point. And if you're always strong, and if you're always clean, and if you're always innocent, like the Pharisees thought they were, and like I pretended I was, grace will remain a foreign concept. It will remain an academic word that we can define. It's unmerited favor, and it's getting what you don't deserve or not getting what you do deserve. We're so clever about all of that. But that experience, how grace comes and meets you there at your lowest point, was what I needed. And that is what grace does. It goes after the weakest one. It seeks out the weakest one and embraces the weakest one. But what do? We find that weak person, the person who smells bad spiritually, and we ask them if they wouldn't mind stepping out of our Bible study group until they have their lives cleaned up, and then they are welcome to come back, but we just don't want the sinners with us. There was a woman like this, fully aware of her sin, who stormed in on Jesus and a company of let's say, shady characters mixed with the holy ones, sitting around a table of all things, and she stormed in reeking to high heaven of sin. And instead of pulling out his wet wipe and putting it over his nose or trying to clean her up, Jesus embraced her and allowed her to touch him and allowed her to honor him, because he knew that the moment she encountered somebody who wasn't ready to scoot her into the black hole and to drop her down a long drop because of the dirt of her life and her deeds, she would be transformed, because that's what the grace that meets the lowest and the dirtiest and the guiltiest, that's what that grace does. It doesn't excuse the sin. It transforms the sinner into somebody who's able to grow into being like Christ. And that's why when that woman humiliated herself and everybody else slammed their heads over their noses and their mouths, Jesus embraced her. Because the law will love only the obedient, the sinless. But grace wants to seek us out at our lowest point. And if we are going to embrace this commandment, we will stop eliminating the people who make us look bad, the people who still swear or smoke or are contemplating divorce or did this or the other sin. those, interestingly, were the people Jesus gravitated towards. Maybe we should too.